There once was a man that walked into a courtroom ready to be judged for the heinous act of murder. And as the proceedings of this court case commenced and the verdict turned against him, the judge brought up his gavel, ready to bring things to a close and condemn him. However, as the judge began to swing the gavel down, time slowed in an instant, like a snap of a finger. And it was in that moment that the courtroom seemed to fade away and change into a dark valley for this man. It wasn't much long after that he began to hear a cacophony of voices, like a thousand voices at once, and he couldn't really figure out what any of them were saying except in intervals. And he realized very quickly that as it got closer and louder, that it was condemnation of all kinds. They were calling him a wretch, a miserable, worthless human being, a man that was beyond redemption, a fool, a liar. They got closer and closer to him. And eventually he realized that when he started to see them vaguely in the darkness, that they were both demons and angels. And mixed in among them was men. There was all kinds of men, from heaven and earth and even hell, it seemed. They surrounded him to such an extent that he couldn't even see between them. He couldn't see the sky before long because he fell to his knees in despair as they continued to kick and spit and condemn him further, telling him that he was beyond redemption, that nobody loved him. This went on for a long time. And he began to grab hold of his head with both hands and scream and cry because he didn't know what else to do. He thought about asking for forgiveness. But when you're being assaulted by a crowd that is telling you that they will never forgive you, why bother? That was the thought he had. But eventually, like another snap of the fingers, as it was when the courtroom faded, it all stopped. And he found himself hunkered down on the ground in silence. It took him a couple seconds, but he eventually looked up and realized that all the figures that were condemning him hadn't vanished, but they had backed off enough that he could see around him again. Not only had they not vanished, however, but they had also turned into amorphous figures. He could kind of see through them as well. Their features were gone, and while they still had a face, it was unrecognizable in a way. They were featureless. They were voids. But there was one figure that he saw that was different from all the others, that was standing suddenly in front of him. And he was wearing a robe and nothing really else. He had a hood on, covering some of his features, but not all of them. He looked somewhat like a man, but one look at this man's black robes and the sinister look on his face was all he needed to know that whoever this man was, he wasn't good. He took a couple steps toward him, this robed man, and stopped in front of him and looked down at him. And he said, "You can make all of this stop, or rather, I can make all of this stop in an instant, just like this." The robed man brought out his left hand and his right and kind of just gestured at all the figures around him. And he said, "You don't need to go through this. All you need to do is take my hand, and this will all go away." Now this man on his knees in despair believed himself to be in total darkness, and he was right. Everything else around him, except for this figure, was dark. There was no light anywhere. And he wondered how he could see, or if he was even seeing at all. But he said, "You can make this go away," and the robed figure just didn't repeat himself. He just nodded in agreement. So the man reached up and took this figure's hand. And just like that, the scene ended. For the rest, or rather for a good chunk of the rest of this man's life, he no longer felt the prick of his conscience as he wandered about day to day doing despicable actions and falling deeper and deeper into darkness, the very darkness he thought he had escaped that day. He didn't have any more restless nights because it was easy to lay down and sleep all of a sudden. He didn't have the prick of conscience or the concern for his soul. anymore, and it was a great relief. But he felt like he had lost something too, and he didn't quite know what it was. Something was missing, something fundamental. He tried to fill that void with all sorts of things. He tried playing video games, he tried listening to music and watching TV, but he never felt anything at all. Even when he did what he thought was right by helping somebody, the only thought going through his head in the midst of that moment was he wanted to try something new. There wasn't really any concern for it, and people always attributed things to him that weren't there. He didn't know what was going on. And finally, after a long, long time of searching, he came to a conclusion, a rather sudden one, and he didn't know where it came from, of what he was missing. The figure, that robed man, had offered him power. And he had spent a good chunk of his life being pragmatic and self-interested, stepping on everybody around him in order to elevate his own self above them. And in all of his relationships, he wanted power and control, so he put out an image of fear and danger, because he wanted to be perceived as dangerous. He wanted to be perceived as successful. And not only did he want to be perceived that way, but he wanted to be that. But as time went on, it got more and more wicked. And it started being less about what the world had to offer and more about something strange. He became so darkened in his thoughts that his motivations became thus corrupted, to the extent that he started to see people as less than himself, less than insects, because he could see all the sin that they were committing, that they were on a course of destruction, and that nothing in this world, not even his own genius, would stop it. And when he realized that they wanted this, that they were eating and devouring one another, he became embittered at them, more so than he already was. He enjoyed that bitterness and that anger because it was the only thing he could feel. So he fueled it until he came to an awful mindset. He believed in the existence of hell eventually, because this robed man, it was like he was still there talking to him, even though he never really saw him again. And eventually he came to this conclusion that the only purpose he had was to drag people to hell with him, and that he would somehow rule over hell. But then there was another voice in the darkness. It sounded like a whisper, but it was powerful, exceedingly so, and the robed man was scared. He didn't see the robed man, he didn't hear the robed man, this black-robed man, but he could feel the fear. The voice said, this whisper, that it is not the image of who you created that I loved. It is the child weeping behind it, that sheds those tears that you always ask, where do they come from? It is not the pride or the statue that is set up like the Wizard of Oz, so to speak, but the child, hiding behind the curtains, pretending to be something because he is rejected by the world around him. In that moment, the illusion of that courtroom came back, or rather, the illusion that the courtroom presented came back. And it broke. And he realized what he had missed in that very significant moment when he took that black-robed man's hand. The angels and the men of heaven were not laughing at him, and they were not condemning him. They were weeping, and they were urging him to look towards Jesus Christ. And when he looked, he felt something inside his chest. It felt like a heartbeat. He didn't know what he was looking at. It was like a ray of light. This man was wearing a beautiful white robe, or at least that's what it looked like from the distance. It was hard for him to really see at that moment. It was so black, and the black robe man was just behind him, making things so much more difficult. But he was backing off because it was like he was being burned. But he was so desperate to keep his hand on this man's shoulder that even amidst the burns, this black-robed man stayed close and whispered, "Don't go back to the pain." But this man didn't listen this time. He pulled his shoulder away from the black-robed man, stood up, and the light that was being shined from heaven created a pathway in the dark valley this time around. And he started walking on that path. And in the end, he said, he asked, "Can you forgive me?" Jesus looked at him and said, "Yes. Do you believe that I am he?" And the man said, "I believe and I trust, my Lord." And the black-robed man disintegrated behind him. God bless.